In 1964, German journalist Günter Gauss interviewed Hannah Arendt for his TV show The Person. The conversation began with a peculiar exchange. Gauss kept insisting on defining Arendt as a philosopher, while she kept gently pushing back the title. Gauss looked perplexed. Arendt no doubt came from the rich tradition of German philosophy, and was the direct student of giant philosophical minds such as Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers. She was the acclaimed author of the major philosophical classics such as The Origins of Totalitarianism, and The Human Condition, and everything she had written had clearly been an intense dialogue with the ideas of Socrates and Kant, Hegel and Heidegger. So why would a thinker of such a high stature and depth deny being part of the philosophical world? The reason was never as superficial as merely arguing about her exact field of inquiry. Arendt's insistence on being considered a political theorist rather than a philosopher held a great meaning for her. It was her stance in the world, her fundamental life statement, around which her entire philosophy revolved. An easy way to approach the distinction she made would be to observe her growing distance from her most influential teacher, Martin Heidegger. Arendt's early encounter with Heidegger at the University of Marburg in 1924 was thrilling. Indeed, so thrilling that it led them to a 4-year secret love affair between a 35-year-old married teacher and an 18-year-old student. Heidegger did not thrill Arendt alone. Students flocked to his lectures, as the rumor spread that here, once again in history, thinking has come to life. In Arendt's words, the spiritually hungry students shared the feeling that finally there exists a teacher, one can perhaps learn to think. 45 years after her initial encounter with the great philosopher, she beautifully wrote, "People followed the rumor about Heidegger in order to learn thinking. What was experienced was that thinking was pure activity, can become a passion which not so much rules and presses all other capacities and gifts as it orders them to prevail them through. We are so accustomed to the old opposition of reason versus passion, passionate spirit versus life, the idea of passionate thinking, in which thinking and aliveness becomes one, takes us somewhat aback. However, thinking as pure activity, which in many ways the definition of philosophy, was gradually to be revealed as quite far from Arendt's own interest and act of thinking. Throughout the years, she began to develop a critical distance from philosophical introspection, Heidegger's in particular. As she grew aware of her own unique mode of thought, she became more and more disturbed with what to her seemed to be a profound lack of concern on Heidegger's part, a self-immersion, so remote from the actual world that its most essential characteristic is absolute egoism, its radical separation from all its fellows. Arendt was troubled that this type of thinking, that kept contemplating only itself, was like a closed circle which is blind to the world and one's relationship with it. Heidegger's explicit involvement with the Nazis, especially his appointment as the rector of the University of Freiburg in 1933, although not directly linked, exactly proved this point. In this, it seemed he confirmed Arendt's sobering realization that doing philosophy, as deep as it may be, does not automatically lead to a moral engagement with the world. This demonstration of the break between philosophy and the world surely shaped her thinking. Without the bridge that could enable thoughtful action, the two were different domains. 20 years after their separation, Arendt forgave Heidegger for his Nazi past, and the two resumed their friendship, which lasted until Arendt's death in 1975. However, her own perception of the role of thinking would never return to the idea of purity of philosophy as she had learned it back from him in 1924. The Heidegger of her youth had been the hidden king ringed in the realm of thinking, but Arendt found other influences which slowly but surely forced her out of this king's realm. For instance, she could not ignore Heidegger's own master, the phenomenologist Edmund Husserl, who called for a quiet revolution in philosophy, away from pure introspection, back to the things himself, he proclaimed. And when she moved from Freiburg to the University of Heidelberg to be tutored by Heidegger's friend Karl Jaspers, she experienced a revelation under the impact of Jasper's concrete approach. philosophical, yeah, is real as it pervades an individual life at a given moment. Arden began to realize that she could not sympathize with Heidegger's introspection, which she defined as thinking which rebounds back on itself and finds its solitary object within the soul. Introspection to her meant isolation. One ceases to be interested in the world and finds only one interesting object, the inner self. In its isolation, thinking becomes limitless because it is no longer molested by anything exterior, because there is no longer any demand for action. Introspection can also fill up a life when the world and action have been rejected. It annihilates the actual existing situation by dissolving it in mood, and at the same time, it leads everything subjective an aura of objectivity, publicity, extreme interest. This tendency towards introspection, Arendt felt, was her youthful era. So she began a journey away from the traditional philosophy. But her final transformation she owes a far greater movement in history, an intervention from the outside world, which troubled her thinking and propelled her to become engaged in previously unimaginable ways. When I was young, recalled Arendt in 1963, I was interested neither in history nor in politics. If I can be said to have come from anywhere, it is the tradition of German philosophy. However, this naive political approach was steadily changing during the early 1930s as she caught an anti-academic mood that made her focus more and more on current affairs. When the Nazi Party demonstrated its increasing power in the German election during that time, her tolerance for thinkers who seemed indifferent to this darkening political situation weakened. But it was only in 1933 when the Reichstag was burned down, leading to a series of arrests, that Arendt's philosophical thinking was completely overturned. One can think of that year as the beginning of a union between thought and action for Arendt, demonstrated by her courageous choice to stay in Berlin. Although she had been considering immigration for months, she felt she could no longer be a bystander. She offered her apartment as a way station for people fleeing Hitler's regime. For the first time, she felt satisfaction not from thinking, but from acting. In her interview with Gunter Gauss, Arendt explained that the period of illegal arrest during 1933, which led to finally to the cells of the Gestapo or concentration camps, was such a shock to me that even after I felt responsible. This newfound sense of responsibility, she added, wiped away any trace of innocence. Another more personal type of shock made her even more disengaged from academic thinking. Arendt, who was ethnically Jewish, found out to her horror that friends she had known and trusted were now collaborating voluntarily with the Nazis. This wave of cooperation, she said, made you feel surrounded by empty space, isolated. I lived in an intellectual milieu. I came to the conclusion that cooperation was, so to speak, the rule among intellectuals. I left Germany guided by the resolution that never again, I will never have anything to do with the history of ideas again. I didn't indeed want to have anything to do with this sort of society again. Arendt then started to search for an understanding of evil, as well as for the conditions from which right judgment and action can emerge. This was her interest into the political domain and her shift from intellectual, a political thinker, into a fully engaged human being with an unambiguous political and historical stance. She strongly felt that philosophy failed to offer a substantial meaning to the world insofar as it vehemently ignored the core of human reality. Man as an acting being, its focus on speculative and metaphysical thinking made it unable to offer anything of substance to the political realm where people came together, judge and act. Escaping to Paris, Arendt immersed herself in anti-war as well as pro-Jewish and pro-Zionist activity. She began to think not in individual but in collective terms. From one who had perceived herself as a world citizen, she moved to recognize that when one is attacked as a Jew, one must defend oneself as a Jew, rejecting the type of thinking that put the individual subject as the center of existence. Arendt started to tell her story historically, as a part of we consciousness. The person was a part of general structure shaped fundamentally by the conditions of one's birth, by one's neighborhood, and by the group of which one was a part of. The problem of the human condition, Arendt concluded, lay in those general structures, or in other words, in the political sphere. For exactly the same reason, Arendt felt strongly that any real change of the human situation, any revolutionary renewal, can take place only in the political realm. A movement, she felt, which does not enter into the political arena and does not translate in its ideology into concrete goals that promote change in the actual situation, would remain abstract and ineffective. So to act in the world, one had to get politically involved. For example, Jewish hopes collapsed in 1937, many Jews began to propose to return to the ghetto. Withdrawing from the European culture community to Jewishness, Arendt saw this as the complete wrong response at the time, when the enemies of Jewry were only growing in power. She believed instead of Jewish reconstruction instead that Jewish reconstruction could only become about in a political context, in the struggle against the forces that threatened it. So as we see, Arendt's thought was completely overturned not by some inner revelation independent of external events and circumstances. Indeed, the uniqueness of Arendt's thinking is already marked by the way she was transformed through the historical and political shifts that took place in Europe. Her type of thinking then became deeply intertwined with the world, with the flux of the world changes. It was an active thinking. Active thinking is a highly engaged form of thinking that prepares one to act in the real world. But more than that, active thinking is in itself already a form of action, since in the very act of thinking in this manner, one is aware that one is a responsible participant in the world, while often thinking is conceived as a form of retreat from the world, disengaging from the flow of events and shifting to a silent introspection. Active thinking is like a commitment to think responsibly, to move away from the comfortable bystander perspective and understand that it is only through engagement that we can rightfully judge. Thus, for Arendt's thinking became a tool with which people can bring a new awareness into their action. This is the opposite of the aimless and involved type of thinking. With Arendt's, thinking has become a powerful tool of engagement. However, Hannah Arendt political thinking was not limited to what one would usually consider politics. Members of a government negotiating certain decisions on behalf of voters. To her, politics is the realm of public mass exchange, interaction, and dialogue. It is the public realm in which people come together, judge, and act, and one's ability to think politically is the ability to make one capable of judging and acting in the real world. Arendt claimed that what in ancient Greece had been rather inseparable, philosophy and politics, gradually separated until eventually philosophy became pure thinking, completely detached from the worldly affairs. However, this was to her so much more than a philosophical problem, since it meant the individual tends to become uninvolved and irresponsible, unaware of their crucial role in the world.